And now let's talk a bit about Cuba. Just yesterday, thousands of people took to the streets in several cities and towns across Cuba to protest against the Communist Party's human rights abuses, against the general lack of freedom, and against the disastrous economic situation that has been present in Cuba over the last 6 decades, but has dramatically worsened over the last several weeks. In short, the Cuban people are protesting against 62 years of socialist and communist repression by the ruling regime. Now, to give you a bit of context about what has been happening in Cuba over the last 6 decades, in case you're not aware, our team, a few months ago, we actually went down to Miami and we created a short video to set the stage for you. Take a look.
Because many Cuban Americans who are living in Miami either escaped from communist Cuba or had parents who did. And as a result, they are deeply suspicious of leftist policy positions. They remember that before the Communist Revolution in 1959, Cuba was a relatively rich country. Certainly there were some deep inequalities, particularly between the cities and the countryside, as well as between different racial groups, but Cuba is still ranked 5th in the hemisphere in per capita income, 3rd in life expectancy, 2nd in per capita ownership of cars, and 1st in TV ownership. But within 2 years of the revolution, Castro's regime confiscated more than $25 billion worth of private property owned by Cubans. And today, Cuba ranks 2nd to last in economic freedom in the Americas, only ahead of Venezuela. Many of the Cuban Americans who are living in Miami were among the 500,000 that ended up fleeing Cuba over the last 2 decades post-revolution.
When people go, they usually go just to Havana and they see like the beautiful touristy part that's actually up, the government does keep up and it's painted and everything. But once you go inside to the actual streets of Cuba, you see the buildings are crumbling. I'm Barbara Lopez and I'm a 2nd generation Cuban American. You know, these are buildings that should be condemned and unlivable, but the Cuban people have no other choice than to live in these buildings because they don't have any money, they don't have anywhere else to go. And you know, there's what they call apagones every night for a certain amount of time. I think it's like 4 or 5 hours that the whole Cuban country, like, well, different provinces, they shut off the lights, electricity, completely. And that's supposedly to save money and the water. You see how they live, you know, they're drinking dirty water, their clothing, everything, they're given to they're sent by their families here.
And now, as of just yesterday, Cubans across the country are rising up. Take a look. There are many videos uploaded online which appear to show demonstrations in several towns and cities, including even Havana, which is the capital of Cuba. And people can be heard chanting things like, "We're not afraid," "We want freedom," and even calling for the end of the dictatorship. One group of protesters appears to have actually taken over a local Communist Party office. And then in Havana, outside of the Communist Party headquarters, they're chanting simply, "Cuba isn't yours." And the protests appear to be extremely widespread, as even in small towns and cities, people can be seen marching through the streets with the Cuban national flag and chanting Libertad, which means liberty. Now, down in Florida, the Cuban American community here in America, down in Miami, they were celebrating what's happening over in Cuba. And they're seen on the streets celebrating, waving both the American as well as the Cuban national flag. And furthermore, the mayor of Miami, he came out yesterday and he said this: "The regime must end now. It is not negotiable. We ask for an international intervention led by the United States to protect the Cuban people from a bloodbath. Cubans are worthy and ready to rule themselves without tyranny. It can end today, and it must end today." Now, in that speech, he referred to a bloodbath. And unfortunately, although frankly as expected, the current president of Cuba, Miguel Diaz-Canel, he's also the first secretary of the Communist Party, he came out and he used the often repeated Marxist government talking point that these protests were initiated by an American smear campaign. Basically, it's foreign interference, and he labeled all of these protesters as insurrectionists. Furthermore, he said this while speaking on state-run TV: "The order of combat is given. The revolutionaries take to the streets." And indeed, according to video footage that we were able to find online, the Cuban security forces, they came into action and they began to disperse the demonstrators, beat the protesters, as well as arrest them and take them away. For instance, here's one video shared by Marco Rubio, which shows some of these security forces, and above the video he wrote, "Here come the communist repression squads in Cuba, still largely being ignored so far by the US corporate media outlets." Now, this is a very large and developing story. In fact, it's happening right now as you're probably watching this video, definitely as we're making this video. And unfortunately, they have been labeled as insurrectionists. They're being detained. And like I mentioned earlier, the internet looks like it's coming down. People are not able to communicate with either each other or get things out into the outside world. However, we will be keeping a close eye on what's happening in Cuba and reporting to you any developments as they're coming about. And I'd like to mention something. As you're watching what's unfolding over in Cuba, keep in mind two things. First of all, if they are successful in getting rid of the communist regime, which again has been in power for 62 years, that would change the very dynamics of what is happening across Latin America. That's because the Castro regime has, for decades now, supported communist insurgencies over in Chile, Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, Nicaragua, and so on, and many other countries. If the Cuban Communist Party were to indeed fall, then the Marxist and the socialist groups scattered around Central and South America, they would lose their major backer. And then the second thing to remember is that as the United States currently is flirting with socialism, consider what's happening over in Cuba. Consider also what's happening in Hong Kong as well, or look into the situation in China or North Korea. There's a really great, in my opinion, saying that I once heard, although I looked into it and I was never able to figure out who initially said it, but it's a very wise saying. And the saying goes, you can vote your way into communism, but your grandkids will have to shoot their way out. And when you look at history, there's a lot of truth to that statement.